Hey, 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 it's Deanne here. How are you? Today, we are on video number 5 of the Ultimate Digestion series, and we are going to be talking all about the small intestine. So, anything you need to know about that area, you're going to learn today. So, let's talk about where it is. This is a long tube that's connected to the stomach and then connects to the large intestine. And as you can see from the picture, it's all the colored portion. There are three structures within the small intestine. That first portion, it can either be called the duodenum or the duodenum. So you may hear it both ways. The second portion is the jejunum, and the third is the ileum. And one thing to keep in mind is that the lining of the small intestine is covered with these finger-like projections. We call them villi. There's smaller ones called microvilli, and this allows for more surface area for absorption. The absorptive area of all of the small intestine is the size of a tennis court. Crazy, right? So the functions of the small intestine: digestion. So most of the food is going to be broken down in the small intestine by enzymes and digestive juices. There's going to be absorption through the small intestine. So all the foods we eat, the vitamins and minerals, carbohydrates broken down, the fats, the proteins are going to be absorbed through the lining to move into the bloodstream, and immune function. So let's look at the three different portions of the small intestine to see exactly what they look like and what their functions are. So let's start with the duodenum. It is about 10 to 12 inches long, and it's C-shaped. It's kind of that burgundy color in the photo. It comes right off of the stomach and then connects to the jejunum. And this is where that chyme, that food that has been mixed together in the stomach, is now entering the small intestine. There has to be neutralization because all that food, remember we talked about how acidic the stomach is. So we have to neutralize that acid so it doesn't injure the lining of the small intestine. And then this is where more and more mixing is going to happen so we can really break down the food that we've eaten. The jejunum is about 8 feet long. This is where we have a lot of enzymatic action, more and more to break it down even more. And this is where the most absorption takes place. The ileum is about 10 to 12 feet long. This is the longest section of the small intestine. And here we have absorption of B12, of bile salts, of anything remaining that didn't get absorbed in the jejunum. And this is where a lot of the immune function takes place. It's also that transition, that ileocecal valve is where the ileum then becomes the large intestine or the colon. And that valve prevents backflow from the large intestine back into the small intestine. So again, main functions: digestion, absorption, and immunity. And we are going to break these down so you understand them even more. So food from the stomach now enters into the small intestine. And this, just the entrance of the food, it causes a hormonal reaction. So we have secretin and cholecystokinin are released. The secretin stimulates the pancreas to release bicarbonate, and that is what's going to neutralize any acid that's left over in that chyme so it doesn't injure the small intestine. The CCK stimulates the gallbladder to release bile, and that is going to help break down the fat. And it's also going to stimulate the pancreas to release pancreatic enzymes to break down carbohydrates, fat, and proteins. Okay, so let's look at further breakdown of the food. We have these carbohydrates that we're eating. So we have a pancreatic enzyme called amylase that breaks these carbohydrates, these big pieces of carbohydrate, into smaller molecules. Then we have enzymes in the lining of the small intestine that break these pieces down even smaller. So they're simplest, and that's glucose and fructose. And those are the forms that we actually absorb through the small intestine. Proteins, we have pancreatic protease, and there's several of those that break down proteins into smaller pieces. Then again, we have enzymes in the small intestinal lining that break those into further pieces down into amino acids where we can absorb them. Fats, lipase breaks down triglycerides into smaller components. Bile, that's made in the liver but stored in the gallbladder, then breaks down the fat. Okay, so we're trying to break all the food that we're eating down into these teeny tiny particles that can then be absorbed through the lining of the intestine and move into the bloodstream so we can actually absorb it and use it as energy. So now we're moving into absorption. The reason this is important is because this is the way that our body gets nutrients from our food. This is the way that we make energy. We build and repair tissues. The healing happens, and then we can maintain our overall health is through eating food, digesting, absorbing those nutrients so we can make energy from those nutrients. So even if you're eating healthy, if you're not absorbing the food, then you can still have maldigestion. You can still have malnutrition. You can still not feel great, low energy, brain fog, all of those things because you're really not absorbing the nutrients. So let's look at how absorption happens. They're finger-like structures called villi and microvilli. And these are kind of like sponges, and they soak up those really small nutrients. And think of this, every square inch of the mucosa in the small intestine contains 20,000 villi. So that's a lot of area where things can be absorbed. So once these particles are absorbed, the nutrients pass through the walls of the villi and then enter into little tiny blood vessels called capillaries, then move the food into the bloodstream. Glucose is what we use for energy. Amino acids we use to build and repair tissues. And fatty acids are used for energy and to build cell membranes. Specific vitamins. So let's look at each different portion of the small intestine to see what we're absorbing where. In the duodenum, we are absorbing iron, calcium, and magnesium. And magnesium can be absorbed all throughout the small intestine. This is just the first place that it starts to be absorbed. Calcium can only be absorbed if there's vitamin D around. That's why vitamin D is so important. And when you go to your doctor, you should always have your vitamin D levels checked. And most people, every one of my clients is on vitamin D3 because they are low in vitamin D. Fat soluble vitamins, those are vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K. These start to be absorbed right here, and then they're also continually absorbed throughout the rest of the intestine. In the jejunum, this is the major area where we're absorbing most of our food. The carbohydrates that have been broken down into glucose and fructose, the proteins that have been broken down into amino acids and smaller peptides, the lipids, the fat that's been broken down into smaller particles like fatty acids, monoglycerides, and then the fat-soluble vitamins, and then the water-soluble vitamins. These are mainly the Bs, 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, vitamin C, and the mineral zinc. And in the ileum, those bile salts that have been released from the gallbladder to help break down the fatty acids, they need to be reabsorbed and recycled back to the liver. So that's where this happens in the ileum. Vitamin B12 is absorbed in the ileum, but it must be bound to intrinsic factor. And if you remember from 2 videos ago, we were talking about the stomach. The intrinsic factor is released from the lining of the stomach. It then binds to the vitamin B12, and that's how it's carried through the small intestine, and then it's absorbed in this area. Water and electrolytes, significant absorption of water, sodium, potassium, and chloride happens here. Now let's look at immunity. So the immune system, there's about at least 70%, probably more like 80% of the immune system actually lives in the gut. And we call it the GALT, the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And this is the tissue that detects and responds to pathogens, bacteria, viruses, toxins, to prevent them from moving out of the intestines and into the bloodstream. So the functions of this immune system, the GALT, include barrier protection. So the lining of the small intestine is like a wall. It doesn't let things through. the mucus production. So, like the stomach, the lining of the stomach, there is a mucus layer in the small intestine that traps invaders, keeping them out of the bloodstream. This is where our body makes IgA, which is a specific antibody to neutralize and block pathogens and toxins. And then our beneficial gut bacteria, our microflora. So, how do things move through the intestine? This is something we always want to think about because when people are constipated, we know that this is always going to be a part of it. There's not enough movement that's happening through the intestines. So, the main form is peristalsis. That's that wave like contraction of the smooth muscles in the intestinal walls that move the food along. There's an actual circular contraction behind the food and a longitudinal contraction ahead of the food that moves the food forward. There's something called segmentation. This actually doesn't move the food, but this is what kind of churns the food. So it's able to be digested more. So again, it's not moving the food forward, but it's moving it around and around, churning it up. Then there's the migratory motor complex. This is like the cleanup crew. This is a wave like muscular contraction that happens after you eat. And it's like sweeping the stomach and the small intestine between meals, when you sleep, and it's just getting rid of all that kind of extra debris. Now, the enteric nervous system. This is where most issues happen for people. It's with their nervous system. The gut has its own nervous system called the enteric nervous system. We often call it the second brain. It has tons of nerves that are embedded in the walls, and they function independently of our brain and our spinal cord. But they do communicate with the CNS, the central nervous system, through the vagus nerve, which you've probably heard me talk about. So, the important things that this nervous system does is to coordinate the movement, the peristalsis, the migratory motor complex, and that churning. The nervous system also regulates the secretion of digestive enzymes and intestinal juices so the food can actually be broken down. It modulates blood flow. We have to have blood flow to the intestines in order for any of this to happen. The blood nourishes the intestines. It contains receptors to detect changes in the chemical composition of the chyme, that food that's moved out of the stomach, and stretch receptors. So this is how our body knows when we've eaten enough. It sends signals to the body to keep moving things through. That's how our body talks to different areas. It also interacts with the GALT, that lymphoid tissue. The sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight, they call it the stress response. This slows down digestion. And it totally makes sense because when we're in the mode to survive, when we're in the mode to either fight something or flee, we certainly don't want to be hungry. We certainly don't want to have to go to the bathroom. So we really want our digestive system to be turned down. But the thing to remember is you don't have to be stressed out to be in your sympathetic nervous system. The majority of us live in our sympathetic nervous system these days because we're rushing around. We're busy, we're working, we're not resting enough. Rest is when we're in the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you're running around doing things, your mind is racing, you're worrying, you're going to be in that sympathetic nervous system and your body is not going to be able to digest and absorb nutrients. When we're in our parasympathetic nervous system, that's when the body stimulates the digestive activity. That's when the peristalsis happens. That's when the enzymes are secreted and breaking down the food. And that's when we have blood flow to our organs. That's why we call it the rest and digest system. There's also that brain gut axis. That's the communication between the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and the enteric nervous system in the gut. Okay. And that happens again through the vagus nerve, that specific nerve that runs from the brain all the way down to the gut. So let's look at the things that can go wrong in the small intestine. So this is important because this is probably what's going on for you if you're having issues in this area. The biggest, most important one to think about is leaky gut, because this really is the origin of a lot of these other ones that I'm going to list. Leaky gut is when the lining of the intestines becomes more permeable than it's supposed to be. We call it leaky because bigger pieces of undigested food, things that are not supposed to move through the intestinal lining into the bloodstream, actually are able to do that. You may have bloating, gas, abdominal pain, diarrhea, constipation, fatigue. There's a lot of things that you can have. And these are very common symptoms. So they can also be a problem for other issues with the gut. But the impact is that this can cause an immune response and inflammation. So, this is what is going to be kind of that initial problem that becomes a bigger problem where you have food intolerances. You maybe get diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. You start getting so much inflammation that maybe you start having cardiovascular disease or diabetes. So, this is kind of that beginning stage where things are moving through the intestinal wall that should not be. So let's look at why this happens. Poor diet is probably number one. High sugar that a lot of people are eating in the standard American diet disrupts the balance of gut bacteria. So that leads to inflammation. Processed foods, things that come in a bag and a box that, the food that people can easily just run in and pick up and eat in their car, that food irritates the gut lining. Gluten, the protein in wheat, in bread, in processed food, anything that has flour in it that has gluten, that's going to trigger an immune response for a lot of people that damages the gut lining and causes this leaky gut. Alcohol can weaken the intestinal barrier and cause inflammation. Chronic stress, being in that sympathetic nervous system the majority of the day, causes a high release or a lot of cortisol in the body that can disrupt the gut lining. And of course, all of those things are going to increase inflammation. Certain medications, Motrin, Aleve, Advil, can irritate and damage the gut lining. Antibiotics can kill our microflora, the good bacteria that we need. And steroids can weaken the intestinal barrier. Infections, bacteria, viruses, they damage the gut lining. Environmental toxins, pesticides, glyphosate affect the gut lining. Heavy metals, a lot of mercury from eating fish, from having silver fillings, can be toxic to the gut lining. And just a lack of fiber leads to poor gut health and a weaker gut lining. So here's a picture so you can maybe understand leaky gut a little bit better. So under the hot pink legend that says healthy gut, this is what we want our intestinal lining to look like. We have these cells with the little fingers. Those are the villi and the microvilli, and they're very, very close together. Tight junctions that are only letting teeny little bits of nutrients in. But when you look on the other side, the leaky gut side, you see that for one, there's cells that don't even have villi and microvilli. And now those tight junctions are no longer tight. So all of those things can move through the intestinal lining into the bloodstream. So let's look at other things that can go wrong past leaky gut. Celiac disease is when you ingest gluten, you actually have an allergy to wheat, barley, and rye. And again, what this does is it damages the villi and the microvilli. You can have diarrhea, you can have bloating and gas, you can have fatigue, weight loss, you can have skin rashes, you can have a lot of brain fog. Crohn's disease. This is an inflammatory bowel disease that can affect any part of the gastrointestinal tract, but it often affects the small intestine. So it can actually also be in the colon. This can cause abdominal pain, lots of diarrhea, weight loss, anemia, fatigue, and it's just inflammation in the actual lining. And that can lead to scarring, narrowing of the intestine, and you're just not absorbing your food. SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So this is when something is happening maybe with the ileocecal valve, because this is when the majority of our bacteria is in the colon and we're getting a backup of that colonic bacteria into the small intestine. So we have kind of an overload of bacteria in the small intestine. If you're eating and you're having lots and lots of bloating, gas, diarrhea, like right after you eat, then this can be one of the problems. This is just too much bacteria that interferes with digestion and absorption. Lactose intolerance. Many of us have this because as we age, we lose or we don't make as much lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down the sugar lactose. So that just means when you eat milk products, dairy products, then you may end up having bloating and diarrhea. Ulcers, duodenal ulcers. So this is when you again have that irritation in the gut lining that keeps happening, gets deeper and deeper. And that usually happens because of acid. The acid, we're not neutralizing the acid that's moved from the stomach into the duodenum. It may be because of H. pylori infection, certain medications, very similar to the ulcers that we talked about in the stomach. Malabsorption syndrome, that could happen with chronic pancreatitis, the surgeries that we talked about when some people have surgeries to lose weight and it actually bypasses certain portions of the small intestine so things aren't absorbed as well. Obstruction, you can actually have something blocking the small intestine, and there also is cancer. So now let's go over ways, natural ways that you can prevent any of these problems from happening in the small intestine. Let's start with nutrition. A balanced diet. And when I say balanced diet, what I mean is healthy fat, protein, and lots of veggies. Healthy fat, olives, olive oil, avocado, nuts and seeds, protein that can be plant protein or organic chicken, grass fed beef, wild fish, veggies of all colors. Fiber rich foods, again, that's veggies, veggies, veggies. That's beans, legumes, fruits. Probiotics are the bacteria, the good bacteria in our gut. And we can find those and get those from yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, and other fermented foods. Prebiotics are the foods that we take in that feed the good bacteria. Garlic, onions, bananas, lots and lots of different things. As we said before, limiting sugar and artificial additives and processed foods are going to be better for the health of the intestinal lining. Reducing refined grains, getting rid of the gluten is always going to help, and eating good sources of protein. Intentional eating. I talk about this all the time. So it's not just what you eat, it's how you eat, when you eat, and where you eat. Make sure you are relaxed before eating. Remember, we have to be in the parasympathetic nervous system in order to digest our food. So we need to be relaxed. You can do that by sitting down, by breathing, taking, 6 inhales and exhales slowly, by looking at your food, by smelling your food, by being grateful for your food, and then taking small bites, chewing thoroughly, and, really savoring your food, really enjoying it. Lifestyle changes. We've got managing stress because we want to be out of that sympathetic nervous system, that stress response. We can do that through mindfulness, meditation, yoga, deep breathing, many, many ways, walking outside, lots of different ways. Getting quality sleep, between 7 and 9 hours of good, sound sleep. This is when we heal. Regular movement. It doesn't have to be what we call exercise, since so many people do not like to exercise. It's just movement. It's walking, it's biking, it's cleaning the house, it's gardening, where you're not sitting down. Avoid smoking, because this can impair the mucosal lining of the gut and contribute to inflammation. And limiting exposure to toxins, pollutants, chemicals. They can be found in our food, our air, our water, our beauty products, and our home cleaning products. Limiting alcohol because it can irritate the gastrointestinal lining. Identifying and avoiding trigger foods. So you may want to pay attention to certain foods that may affect your digestive system a certain way. Even healthy foods that you consider healthy, like tomatoes, can be problematic for many people. Support digestive enzymes. When you're eating intentionally, you are giving your body time for that the chemical signaling to stimulate your pancreas to release enzymes. And if you eat raw fruits and vegetables, they also contain digestive enzymes. So you want to think about those two things. Limiting medications, Motrin, Advil, Aleve, Birth control pills can actually alter the composition of your microflora. So if you're on birth control pills, I would recommend that you take a probiotic. Antacids just reduce stomach acid, which of course we need for digesting food. We need that to break down the food so our vitamin B12 can be released from the food and then be absorbed. And then antibiotics. Antibiotics will kill the bad bacteria, but they're also going to kill the good bacteria. So if you have to be on antibiotics, it's a good choice to also be on a probiotic, taking it at a different time than you're taking your antibiotics. So what I really want you to take away from this is that you have control over the health of your gut by making good decisions, by making beneficial choices, by eating healthy foods, by being intentional when you eat, by sleeping and having fun and staying away from toxins. Those are all things that you have some control over. And I just want you to understand what is going on, because there are things that you can do on your own. You can start working on your diet. You can start trying to get more sleep, moving more, all of these things that we just talked about today. But that's also what I can help you with as well. And I can take a look at what's truly going on in your small intestine by testing, by doing different tests that show me if there is an infection, so we can treat that infection. If you're not absorbing your food, so we can get to the point of why you aren't doing that, what your immune activity looks like in your gut. That's what the tests tell me. So with all of your information and the tests, I can help you the best. And sometimes we have old habits. We're telling ourselves certain things. We have patterns that we repeat over and over again. I have so many friends and so many clients who say, I really want to get healthy, but when it comes down to eating, I just can't seem to eat the healthy foods that I know are healthy. So that's something I can help you work on. I can ask you questions to really find out what it is that's stopping you. So I have a root cause call. It's absolutely free. It is not a sales call, where you answer a few questions. So I have a little bit of background about you, and then we get on the phone for 15 minutes. We talk about what's going on with you, and then I can give you a really great idea of what your root causes are for what's going on with you. And I can give you steps that you can do on your own to start moving forward. So your small intestinal issues, your digestive issues, your gut issues aren't stopping you from living the fabulous life that you want to live. So I hope this has helped you, and I can't wait to see you next time.